The customary murmur of expectation as attorneys rustled documents filled the courtroom. Spectators murmuring in low tones, Judge Amelia Clarke sat at the bench, her gaze calm and professional, listening to the distant sound of a gavel striking in another room. She believed that it was just another day, another case. The bailiff called the case. Louisiana State versus Babakar Doip. A familiar ache of disappointment fell in Amelia's chest as she shifted slightly in her position, her hands resting on the polished oak of the bench, and she looked at the ERS in front of her: assault, robbery, and resisting arrest. Another lost soul entangled within the system. She believed that when the defendant entered her universe, the man in front of her shook at the man standing in front of her wasn't the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face was lined with years of hardship, but his eyes were bright. Her throat tightened as a flood of memories surged forward, recalling the summer afternoons they spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana, the late-night conversations under the magnolia tree in her backyard, and the promises they made as children to always have each other's backs no matter what. There was no mistaking those soulful, profound eyes. For the first time in her life, Amelia's hold on the gavel changed. As she struggled to comprehend the impossibility, the room appeared to contract as the walls pressed in. Babakar looked up, a look of shock and resignation flashing in his eyes. But he swiftly turned his head away, bowing slightly while the courtroom waited. Amelia compelled herself to talk. "Mr. Anderson, how do you respond to the charges of robbery and assault?" Babakar's voice was harsh, nearly unidentifiable, and she wanted to stop everything to demand answers about what had happened to him and how their paths had intersected, diverged so greatly. But she had to maintain her composure in order to fulfill her role as a judge, so she spoke more steadily than she felt as. The prosecutors started with their opening remarks. Amelia's thoughts were racing because this wasn't just any case. This was Babakar, and she needed to figure out how to keep her past and present apart before it was too late. The courtroom shifted as her thoughts strayed to She and Babakar had grown up on different sides of Hammond long before she wore her black robes and held the gavel in her fingers. Louisiana was split by the unwritten laws of their segregated town, not by geography. Her family's home was a simple one-story home with a white picket fence, while the bond between Babakar's family and Fields, who lived in a dilapidated house at the end of a dirt lane, had been unusual. She recalled how Babakar had been fishing his line when they happened to cross paths at the brink of a brook when she had strayed too far from her own backyard. In the midst of the readings, she had offered to assist, and that small gesture had developed into years of shared dreams and covert adventures. He had once said, "Amelia, you ever think about leaving this place, like really getting out, going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" As they were lying on the grass next to her under the stars. She had laughed and dismissed the thought. However, Babakar wasn't kidding even as a little boy. He recognized the world as a place that didn't always accommodate people like him. Their relationship became stronger in spite of the whispers. Then one day it all came to an end. It was the summer before high school, and Amelia's father caught them sitting on the porch together. His voice had been cold and sharp with authority, and Eleanor had hesitated, looking at Babakar, who stood frozen in place. "Go on," he said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you around." But they had not truly seen one another since her father had forbidden her from seeing Babakar. And shortly after, Babakar's family departed. She went to law school, pursuing dreams of justice and fairness, but she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like. Now, sitting on the bench, she wondered what had happened to Babakar after she had entered that house and ended their friendship. His record revealed a string of arrests for infractions like petty theft and loitering, nothing that seemed particularly violent, but then again, how much of someone's life could. The prosecutor's voice brought her back to the present in a few lines on a rap sheet, as he described the accused offense. Babakar was arrested a few streets away, with the cash allegedly still in his hands after he allegedly assaulted a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge, leaving the clerk with minor injuries and the cash register empty. As the prosecutor spoke, Eleanor observed Babakar. He was slouched, with his hands clasped in front of him, but his look was inscrutable. Did he actually do it, or was there more to the story than what the prosecution had explained? Stated that the courtroom was adjourned for a lunch break, allowing Eleanor to collect her thoughts before returning to her chambers. Her helper Margaret came over with a tentative look. "Judge Hayes, are you all right? You appeared a little preoccupied." In response to Margaret's question about whether it would be impolite for her to reveal that she knew the defendant, Eleanor shook her head and said, "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't. When the trial recommenced, the courtroom was crowded, reporters scrawled notes, the clerk shuffled, and the past she had buried so deeply sat just feet away, waiting for her verdict. How could she be? Documents and Richard Powell, the prosecution, a shrewd, fussy man, was prepared to present his case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Powell started his voice company. This case involves violence. It concerns a man who entered a convenience shop, attacked an innocent worker without warning, and then stole the cash register contents. The evidence will prove Babakar Anderson's guilt of this crime. The prosecutor's tone was clinically detached, as if Babakar were just a name on a docket. Amelia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She looked at Babakar, who kept her eyes on the table in front of him, and Lisa Porter Rose, the defense lawyer, who was giving her opening statement. The prosecution would have you believe that this case is young but self-assured, with a voice that could be heard across the room. Simple. However, it's not for my client. We will demonstrate that there is more to this narrative, and that presumptions made the night of the arrest do not stand up to investigation, even though Babakar Anderson has maintained his innocence from the beginning. A store clerk who had been working the night of the incident was called as the first witness. He described seeing a man who fit Babakar's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. His testimony was thorough, but it seemed staged in some ways. Lee's surgical cross-examination was used. You mentioned, Mr. Chambers, that the individual who assaulted the clerk was dressed in a red. Is that correct, Hoodie? It was dark, and he had his hood on. But the witness did respond. Did you see his face clearly? Lisa nodded and paced a little. So you're implying that you were unable to identify the perpetrator of the assault with certainty? Well, no, but no more inquiries. Lisa interrupted him. As if the conversation had given him a flicker of optimism, Amelia saw Babakar move slightly in his seat, his shoulders squaring. The next piece of evidence was a security tape from the shop. A figure wearing a red sweatshirt was seen entering the store in the shaky, dimly illuminated video. The prosecution claimed that Babakar was on the video, but as it played, it was hard to make out any distinguishing characteristics due to the poor quality. Eleanor carefully examined the footage. Is this really Babakar? The creature scurried around, grasping at the counter before vanishing from view. The video terminated suddenly, leaving a spooky, narrative gap. Babakar's defense rested on an alibi. He stated that he was on his way home from a friend's house when the crime occurred, but he refused to testify. Lisa contended that the absence of a willing witness did not invalidate Babakar's claims, citing concern about communal reprisals. Eleanor felt the weight of her position pressing down on her as the trial went on. She was supposed to be impartial and a pillar of fairness, but how could she be when every moment brought back memories of their childhood? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom, and she was the one tasked with deciding his fate. When the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the gavel, wanting to speak to Babakar and ask him directly what had transpired. But she was aware that any communication outside of the courtroom would put her in danger. The case and her professional life, as she observed Babakar being led in shackles out of the chamber, Amelia's determination faltered. She had always trusted the legal system to uncover the truth, but for the first time, She questioned whether it could ever fully comprehend the reality. As the trial came to a crucial point, the courtroom was alive with soft whispers. Lisa Porter called her first important witness, Officer Daniel Harris, and the arresting officer, Eleanor, leaned forward a little, her eyes narrowing. This was the point at which any cracks would appear, revealing to Officer Harris a burly man with a rough manner made a stand. Lisa calmly and deliberately approached him, saying, "Officer Harris, you were the one who apprehended my client, correct?" "That's right." He responded. "You stated in your report that Mr. Anderson was walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And what led you to believe he was the suspect?" Harris moved in his chair and fit the description of a black man in his mid-40s dressed in dark apparel. The suspect in the video was characterized as wearing a red hoodie, but Lisa's eyebrows went up because of the slightly dark apparel. "When you searched Mr. Anderson, did you discover a red hoodie in his possession?" Harris was hesitant, but he might have thrown it away. Lisa moved closer. "Would you or any other police have searched the area to find this alleged sweatshirt from there?" Harris's mouth clenched. "No, we didn't have time," and he was swiftly captured. Lisa persisted. "So to be clear, you detained my client based on a hazy description without any tangible proof connecting him to the incident." The officer's silence was more powerful than words, and Amelia's eyes darted to the jury, where a few members exchanged doubtful looks. "Officer Harris, do you remember if Mr. Anderson mentioned anything at all?" Lisa wasn't finished. "He protested and claimed to be innocent at the time of his detention. Did you think about looking into his claim, or did you believe he is guilty based alone on his appearance?" Harris's expression changed as he stepped down his credibility. "I followed protocol," Lisa reiterated, her voice tinged with doubt. "No more questions, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed once more. Lanark's heart was clearly affected. This was not simply a trial. It was a reckoning for Babakar as well as for a system that seemed all too ready to condemn him. The defense's next move was surprising. Lisa presented a forensic analyst as an expert witness who had examined the security tape, stated that there was no reliable method to verify based on the person's height and build in the video. It was Babakar, and the timestamp on the video had been changed, casting doubt on its veracity. The prosecutor tried to brush the testimony off as speculative, but the jury seemed uneasy. A shadow of doubt crept into the room, and Eleanor felt its weight as the day came to an end. Babakar was given the chance to testify for himself. Despite Lisa's warnings about the dangers, Babakar insisted on standing in chains and softly clinking. His voice was quiet as he walked up to the stage, but it was full of genuine sincerity. Babakar started speaking straight to the jury, saying, "I've made mistakes in my life. I've made bad decisions and trusted the wrong people, but that night when the police stopped me while I was going about my own business on my way home, they didn't question me. They just assumed I fit the bill." His voice cracked a little as he went on. "I've been fighting my entire life to be seen as more than what people assume about me. But this is tired. I just want the truth to matter." As Babakar sat back down, Amelia's throat constricted as he spoke, pleading not only for justice, but also for humanity. She looked at the jury's faces, which showed a range of emotions, including doubt, empathy, and uncertainty. This was it. The truth was no longer limited to the evidence or testimonials. It was a struggle against the weight and a war of conscience, of bias and presumption. Amelia understood that her job was to interpret the law in a way that promoted true justice, not only to enforce it. The trial's last day began with great expectation, and the prosecution used the circumstantial evidence to support his closing remarks, which urged the jurors to have faith in the system's workings. The man on trial, Eleanor, listened carefully as Lisa begged the jury to see past the obvious and take into account the flaws in the case. Her role was obvious. She could not influence the jury, but she would have the last say. Word if their decision was open to interpretation, the onus of making sure. Justice weighed heavily on her. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom filled and emptied as people whispered to one another or stretched their legs. Babakar sat quietly with his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had looked at Eleanor since the first day of the trial, and she couldn't blame him. What could she possibly say to make this better? When the BFF finally announced that the jury had reached a verdict, the room fell silent, and the four people stood with a piece of paper trembling in her hands. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus Babakar Anderson, we find the defendant. The pause was intolerable. Not guilty. A mixture of gasps, whispers, and even a little applause filled the crowd. In order to restore order, Eleanor tapped her gavel. Babakar's shoulders slumped as though a burden had been removed, but his face remained unreadable. It was evident that this victory had come at a price. Eleanor spoke to the court in a steady voice, saying, "The jury has spoken, Mr. Anderson. You are free to go. Court is adjourned." The courtroom emptied, and she lingered behind to watch Babakar sign his release paperwork. For a brief moment, she thought he might walk away silently, but he turned and came up to her. The room was almost empty now. Just a few people remained. Margaret gathering files and clerks cleaning up. Babakar paused several steps away from the bench, his face guarded. "You don't." He muttered something in a soft voice. "But I'd like to know why you didn't say anything since you knew me." "Since I had to be fair, and if I had said something that would have put the case in jeopardy." Amelia felt her throat tighten as she spoke. "The world has never been fair. Not for people like me," Babakar said, studying her face with a mixture of hurt and understanding. "Fair," he repeated. She nodded slowly, her eyes falling to the polished wood of the bench. "You're right. I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." Babakar let out a sigh. His stance is a little less tense today. "When we were children, we didn't know any better, but now you know, don't you?" Babakar offered a slight nod before turning and leaving with his back straight as he vanished through the courthouse doors after Eleanor muttered, "I'm sorry," in a forceful voice. The trial had shown a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just about verdicts and evidence. It was about the lives shaped by systems far larger than any one person. For Eleanor, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that her position wasn't just a seat of power, but also a platform for change. She had upheld the law, but she sat alone in the empty courtroom with the weight of his words pressing on her. That evening, when she walked out of the courthouse, the fading sun cast long shadows on the steps of a courthouse, although it would be difficult, if not impossible, to ensure that the future carried more than hollow promises of justice. Eleanor silently vowed that she could not undo the past, but that she owed it to Babakar and to herself to try.